the small, quiet town of Marshall, Michigan, the autumn air carried a chill that nipped at the tip of every leaf that rustled in the crisp breeze. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, a sense of foreboding began to settle in the heart of a 20-year-old named Tim. It was Halloween night, and the only thing that matched the darkness outside was the bitterness in his heart. Tim had expected to spend the evening among friends, laughing and reveling at the annual Halloween party hosted by his closest companions. After all, they had been planning it for weeks. Costumes had been meticulously selected, pumpkins carved, and eerie decorations draped all around. But as the clock ticked closer to the party's starting time, Tim's phone remained silent, devoid of the invitation he had been so sure was coming. His anger and confusion bubbled, overtaking his rational thoughts. His friends had always been tight-knit, or so he had thought. His loyalty to the group had been unwavering, and he couldn't fathom why they had left him out. It was as if he had suddenly become invisible to them, replaced by an eerie emptiness that seemed to linger around him. Tim paced through his dimly lit home, a cozy cottage nestled on the outskirts of town. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for the party to start. He knew the address, and the temptation to crash the party gnawed at him. The idea of barging in, confronting his so-called friends, and demanding answers was almost too tempting to resist. Yet he held himself back, deciding to stay home. A heavy silence enveloped the cottage, broken only by the distant howling of the wind. Tim's anger had now transformed into a sense of loneliness and isolation that weighed on him like a heavy shroud. The party lights from his friends' gathering were likely twinkling merrily in the near distance, a cruel reminder of his exclusion. As he wandered from room to room, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of desolation. The isolation in the house mirrored his emotional isolation. But for now, there was nothing more than that. He was alone, and the night was still young, leaving him with hours to contemplate what had driven his friends to betray him in such a cold-hearted way. The solitude inside Tim's cottage seemed to grow denser with every passing minute. His mind raced, replaying the events of the evening, trying to make sense of why he'd been left out. He couldn't escape the feeling that something was amiss. His heart hammered in his chest, a blend of anger and fear gnawing at his senses. Tim wandered over to the living room window, gazing out into the inky darkness. The only illumination came from the dim streetlights lining the quiet road. For a brief moment he was lost in his thoughts, wondering if his friends were having a grand time, unaware of the turmoil they had caused him. But then it happened, a flicker of movement, something that drew his attention. His eyes fixated on the window pane. There, in the murky gloom, he thought he saw a shadowy figure. It was impossible to discern any features, only a vague outline, a silhouette that was there one moment and gone the next. A shiver coursed down Tim's spine. He dismissed it as a trick of the imagination at first, blaming his frazzled nerves for playing tricks on him. Yet, he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that he was not alone. He moved closer to the window, peering outside, straining to make out any details. He half expected to see one of his friends, perhaps, feeling guilty and coming to check on him. But as his gaze scanned the front yard, it revealed nothing but the empty, moonlit street. His pulse quickened, his anxiety now intermingled with a growing dread. Time passed, and with each passing moment, Tim's unease intensified. He would catch glimpses of that fleeting, shadowy presence out of the corner of his eye. It wasn't his imagination, he was certain of it now. Someone or something was lurking near his house. Fear gripped him as he pondered the possibilities. Was it a prank by his friends, an elaborate attempt to mess with him on Halloween night? Or was it something more sinister, a presence from the unknown? Tim couldn't fathom the truth, but one thing was undeniable. He was no longer alone, and whatever lurked in the darkness outside was beginning to assert its presence with an eerie, relentless persistence. Tim couldn't take it any longer. The persistent glimpses of a shadowy figure outside his window had pushed him to his breaking point. Irritation mingled with his fear, and he was determined to confront the source of his torment. "Enough of this nonsense," he muttered to himself, fumbling for his jacket. He marched to the front door and, with clenched fists, swung it open, convinced he would find his friends lurking in the darkness, giggling at their cruel prank. But as he stepped onto the porch and scanned the yard, he was met with nothing but an eerie silence. The street was empty, the air still, and his friends were nowhere in sight. Frustration welled up inside him. He could have sworn he had seen something, but now it was all a maddening enigma. Tim returned inside, leaving the door ajar, believing it was merely his own paranoia that had led him to this point. As he walked back into the dimly lit living room, his nerves remained on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, that he was not alone in his own home. The unease deepened as he moved through the house, turning on lights in an attempt to dispel the lingering shadows. His heart raced, and every creak of the floorboard sent a jolt of panic through him. Tim started to question his own sanity. Perhaps he was overreacting, letting his imagination run wild. But then he heard it, a faint, sinister whisper, like the rustle of leaves on a chilly autumn night. He spun around, searching for the source of the sound. The voice was barely audible, just beyond the threshold of comprehension. Tim's pulse quickened, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He felt an invisible presence drawing nearer, its intention unknown, and the weight of dread pressed upon him like a vice. His footsteps faltered as he retraced his path, moving toward the still open front door. With trepidation, he peered into the night, scanning the porch. It was empty, but his heart pounded in his chest as he realized the front door had now slowly creaked shut. Fear gripped Tim, and he pushed the door open, casting a furtive glance into the empty night. The eerie atmosphere was suffocating, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of paranoia and fear. Back inside, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like fragmented sentences, incomprehensible muttering. Tim's dread swelled as he realized that the intruder was now inside with him. His panic reached a fever pitch, and he searched every room, every corner, desperate to find the source of the haunting voices. The tension mounted, the sinister presence growing closer with each passing moment. Then, just as he turned to re-enter the living room, he saw it, the shadowy figure, tall and menacing, standing in the doorway. Tim's heart stopped, his mind racing to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before him. In the split second that followed, just before the exact instant that would have marked the end of Tim's harrowing ordeal, a deafening, bone-chilling scream pierced the silence, and then a sound of a splash followed by a blackout of the forever kind.